That'll work. Off I go then.
Say the word. Right. Beginning. Aye, my lord. Of course.
Our hero has fallen.
Orders. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord.
Our hero has fallen.
Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord.
Our hero has fallen.
Yes, my liege. On my way. Of course. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course, right. On my way. Orders? Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. What do you need? Of course. Attack! Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Orders. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Yes, my lord. Aye, my lord. What do you need? Say that. Right. On my way. What? Yes, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Right. Of course. Orders. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word.
Build more walls.
Orders. Yes, my lord. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord.
Build more farms. Upgrade complete.
What do you need? Of course. On my way.
Ready to work.
Orders. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Right.
Build more farms.
Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Let me out. Let me out.
Our forces are under attack. More lumber is required.
Yes, my lord. Say the What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Of course. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. What do you need?
Is that Steve's
Say the
map?
word.
That's Steve's nuts.
What is
What do you
it?
need? Orders? Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. On my way. Of course. On my way. What do you need?
Upgrade
Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Say the word. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Say the word. On my way. Yes, my liege. Of course. What do you need? Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Yes, my liege. Of course. What do you need? Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Right. Orders? What do you need? On my way. On my way.
Ready to work.
Right. Aye, my lord. On my way.
Build
Ready to
more
work.
walls.
To arms! Aye, my lord. Right. Say the word. What do you need? Say the word. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Attack! Right. Of course. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Attack! Of course. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. On my way. Let me at 'em. Of course. Orders? Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Of course. What do you need? On my way. Right. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Aye, my lord.
Our hero has fallen.
Orders? Right.
Our allies' hero has
Say the
fallen.
word. do you need? Say the word. Of course, of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Orders? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Right. Say the word. On my way. On my way.
More lumber is
What do you
required.
need?
Our forces are under attack.
Orders? Yes, my liege. Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. On my way. What do you need? Say the word.
Forces are
What do
under
you need?
attack.
Yes, my lord. Orders? What do you need? Say the word. Orders? Of course. Of course. Yes, my liege. Right. Yes, my liege.
Our
Orders?
forces are under attack.
Aye, my lord. Say the word. What do you need? On my way. Yes, my liege. Orders? Say the word. What do you need? Right. On my way.
Upgrade.
Of course.
Our forces are under attack.
Orders? Say the word. Aye, my lord.
Ready to work.
Right. Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my
Building
way.
wall.
Right. Say the word. Of course. What do you need? Orders? Aye, my lord. What do you need? Orders? Of course. On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Orders? Right. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. Of course. Right. What do you need? Orders? On my way. Yes, my liege. Say the word. To arms! Let me at 'em! Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. What do you need? On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Of course. Orders? Say the word. Say the word. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Right. Yes, my liege. Orders? On my way. Of course. To arms! On my way. Yes, my liege. Right. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Attack! Right. Attack! Say the word. Yes, my liege. Let me at him. Aye, my lord. To arms!
Our hero has fallen. Research complete.
Say the word. Of course. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. What do you need? Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Orders?
Our forces are under attack.
Say the word. On my way. Let me go. To arms! Right. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. You need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Of course. Say the word. Right. Of course. Yes, my liege. Yes, my liege. Attack! Attack! You need? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Let me at him. Of course. On my way. Orders? Aye, my lord. What do you need? To arms! Yes, my liege. Right. To arms! Let me at him. Attack! Say the word. Aye, the word. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. On my way. What do you need? Orders? Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Right. Let me at 'em. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. On my way. What do you need? Of course. Attack! Say the word. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. To arms! Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. To arms! Say the word. On my way. Of course. Let me at 'em. Right. Attack! Let me at 'em. Aye, my lord. Attack! On my way. What do you need? Yes, my liege. To arms! Of course. Attack! Aye, my lord. Of course. Let me at 'em. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Yes, my liege. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. To arms!
Not enough mana.
Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. To arms! Right. Attack! Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at 'em. Orders. To arms! Attack! Say the word. Of course. On my way. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Let me at 'em. Right. Of course. Attack! On my way. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Orders? Say the word.
More work?
Yes, my liege. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Let me at 'em. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. On my way. To arms! Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Let me at 'em. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Of course. On my way. Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. To arms! On my way! Attack! What do you need? What do you need? On my way! Aye, my lord. Of course. Right. Right. Of course. Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Orders? Of course. Yes, my liege. Aye, my lord. On my way. Say the word. To arms! Aye, my lord. Right. Attack! Orders? Of course. On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Right. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. What do you need? Say the word. On my way. Right. On my way. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Of course. Right. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Orders? Aye, my lord. Of course. Say the word. Right. What do you need? Yes, my liege. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
What do you need? On my way. Of course. Aye, my lord. Orders? Of course. Say the word. Yes, my liege. Right. What do you need? Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Right. Of course. Say the word. On my way. Orders? Aye, my lord. Say the
Our
word.
forces are under attack.
Aye, my lord. On my way. Right. Aye, my lord. Of course. Yes, my liege. Say the word. Right. On my way. Yes, my liege. On my way. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Say the word. Of course. Orders? On my way. Aye, my lord. Yes, my liege. Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Right. Say the word. My liege. Of course. On my way. On my What do you need? Right. Aye, my lord. Orders? Orders? What do you need? Say the word. Yes, my liege. What do you need? Yes, my liege.
Upgrade complete. Research complete.
Say the word. On my way. Orders? What do you need? Yes, my liege. Orders? Say the word. Right. Orders? On my way. Of course. What do you need? Aye, my lord. Aye, my lord. Of course. On my way. Right. Yes, my liege.